Chapter 6. While Jack graded papers that evening, Coral worked diligently at the mending, knowing she could double his wardrobe in a few short hours by fixing a few things. They worked together in companionable silence. A short while before bed, Jack pushed the papers away. "Would you like to walk with me?" She looked at him with surprise. "It's almost bedtime." "Almost, but not yet." "Please?" Coral nodded. "I'd be happy to." She put her mending back into the basket she had appropriated for the task, and placed it in a corner where it wouldn't be in the way. "Let me just grab a shawl. It's getting cool in the evenings." He waited while she went to their bedroom for her shawl. When she came out, he took it from her and wrapped it around her shoulders before offering her his arm. She took it, surprised that he was acting so cordial with her. She'd expected a lifetime of working together, not a life of courtly manners and gentlemanliness. Once they were outside, she sighed at the sight of the stars spread overhead. Why do the stars seem so much brighter in Montana than they did in Massachusetts? He grinned. "It's because there's less pollution here. The lower pollution levels make it so we can see the stars better." "Is that it?" She really hadn't meant for him to answer her question, but having a logical answer was certainly nice. "I'm not as good with astronomy as I am with biology." "How much do you know about anatomy?" he asked, intrigued. She smiled. "I was apprenticing under a midwife in Massachusetts, without my parents' knowledge. I helped her attend births for several summers, before I finished school, and then for the past year." "Your parents wouldn't have liked that?" She shook her head. "They didn't like it that I finished school early, either. They felt like a woman's one job in life was to attract a wealthy man to be her husband. I didn't feel called to spend all of my time going to cotillions to try to find someone who would only find fault with me." "Why would a man have found fault with you?" he asked, surprised by her words. "Because I overwhelm everyone," she said, her voice small. "What man wants a woman who can do most things better than he can? I'm afraid I can't bring myself to pretend that I can't do a math problem or shoot a rifle, simply to appease the male ego." He shook his head. "How shallow you make all men out to be." "Not shallow exactly." "Maybe their egos are easily hurt?" "Maybe. I'll have you know I'm proud of everything you do so well." "I'm amazed by you, Coral." She shrugged. "Many women can cook. It's not such a wonderful thing." He nodded. "You're right. Many women can cook. But not many can go out and kill their supper, skin it, and then cook it as if it's nothing. Not many women can do advanced mathematics in their heads without a second thought. I've never met anyone quite like you." "Are you silently thanking God there's only one of me?" she asked, a twinkle in her eye. "Well, no, but I'm thanking him that he gave me the only one of you." He stopped walking on the edge of the wooded area not far from his house. "I didn't bring the rifle, so we should probably stay in the open." She nodded, and turned back toward the house, but his hand on her arm stopped her. "What is it?" she asked. "Coral, I know you have it in your head that I am only coming to care for you because of your cooking, but I want you to know it's not true. I care for you because of who you are. You are an intelligent, beautiful woman." "Beautiful? Have you confused me with my sister?" She believed the intelligent part, because she knew she was smart. "Beautiful? Not likely." He shook his head. "Esther's pretty in a different way than you are. To me, Esther is the kind of pretty you look at and walk away from. But you," he caught her upper arms and pulled her to him. "You're the kind of beauty I want to have in my life and my bed for the rest of my days." She blushed, happy he couldn't see her clearly in the darkness. She shook her head. "You don't have to say those things to me. I know what I am. I know what I'm not. You don't see yourself through my eyes, and I wish for just one moment you could." His hand stroked her cheek, his thumb coming to rest on her bottom lip, and he moved it back and forth, enjoying her soft skin. "May I kiss you, Coral?" She nodded, her eyes wide. "I'm your wife." "You don't even have to ask me that." "You're my wife, but you're not my love, yet." "I want you to be, so I'll ask permission." He lowered his head to hers, kissing her softly, just a touch of his lips against hers. His hand stroked up and down her arms. Coral gasped against his lips, moving even closer to him. She liked kissing more than a proper woman should, she feared. "Oh, Jack." Her lips parted under his, and she wrapped her arms around his waist, getting as close to him as she could. After a moment he lifted his head, staring down into her eyes. "I know our marriage started out oddly, but I want your permission to court you." "Properly?" She swallowed hard. "To court me? How can you court me when we're already married? I can pay you the same kind of attention I would have done to get to know you better if you'd had the time." "May I?" She nodded, feeling a bit bemused at the prospect. "No one's ever courted me. To be quite honest with you, I've never courted anyone either. We'll learn how to do it together." "You've never courted anyone?" she asked, surprised by his words. "You seem to know what you're doing." He raised an eyebrow, grinning at her. "I do?" She shrugged. "Well, I guess you could be fooling me into thinking you know what you're doing, and it would work, because I have no earthly idea how to court someone or to be courted." He wrapped his arm around her shoulders and walked her back toward the house. "There's a dance at the school on Saturday night." "There is?" "Yes. One of my students' father plays the fiddle, and he promised he would play. I'd love to have the honor of your company for the dance, Mrs. Smythe." She nodded. "Yes, I'd be happy to go with you." "Good. It's a potluck, so we'll have to take something with us. If you don't mind, I think it would be best if you were the one to see to that and not me." "Absolutely. I'll make something for it." "Do you know if they need items for the actual meal or desserts more?" "No idea. Maybe I'll do one of each." As embarrassed as she was that she was so good at everything, she felt the need to show off her skills as a wife. She always had. Jack smiled, keeping his arm firmly around her. "Whatever you think is best. I wonder if Esther and Brody know about the dance. If they don't, it might be nice if you told them." "I'll do that. I should be able to go see her on Friday without a problem." "Good. I really am impressed with all you've gotten done so quickly at home. I'm glad you're pleased with it." When they arrived at the house, she stepped inside, while he stayed back. "I'll stay out here for 20 minutes, to give you time to get ready." Coral looked at Jack and stood on her tiptoes to brush her lips across his. "Thank you for caring about my feelings so much. I appreciate it." He smiled, stroking his hand down her back. "You're special, Coral." She turned and hurried to get ready, not answering him. She was starting to believe that he truly thought she was special. She didn't know how, and she didn't know why, but maybe if she was special in his eyes, he really would keep her forever. She was already under the covers when he came into bed a short while later. She normally fell asleep the moment her head hit the pillow, but for some reason she was restless that night, thinking about their walk and his desire to court her. She kept her eyes closed until she felt the mattress dip beside her. "Why have you never courted a girl?" Jack turned on his side facing her, something he'd never done before. Usually as soon as they were in bed together, they would lay stiff as boards, pretending the other wasn't there. "There was a girl I wanted to court when I was still living on my stepdad's farm. She was the daughter of a neighboring farmer, and she was pretty as a picture." When he said the girl was pretty, Coral's heart drooped. So he wanted a pretty girl. "Did you ask if you could court her?" "I did. I went to her pa to ask him first, knowing it was proper. And then I went to her and asked." "What did she say?" She told me that she wouldn't spend the rest of her life tied to a farmer. She'd seen the hardship her parents went through, relying on the seasons and the rainfall as they did. She wouldn't be any part of it. He sighed. So I went off to school to be a teacher, thinking that she would be happier with that. What happened then? When I came home with my new teaching certificate, ready to teach in the school we'd both attended, I found out she'd married a local farmer. Coral turned to face him on the bed, taking one of his hands that rested atop the covers in hers. I'd say I'm sorry, but I'm not. If she hadn't done that, maybe you'd have married her. And where would I be? He smiled at that, bringing the hand in to his lips. I really don't know, but I'm sure the answer would not be in my bed. And that would be truly dreadful, wouldn't it? Coral blushed, glad the room was dark. I don't think a man should be talking to the woman he's courting that way. Oh, but when we're in bed together, we're no longer just courting, Coral. When we're in bed together, we're husband and wife. Do you regret promising to wait until I turn 18? Sometimes, he answered honestly. But I do think it's smart for both of us. We'll have plenty of time to get to know each other and know our own hearts if we wait. He kissed her softly before rolling onto his back. Now go to sleep. Coral grinned, rolling to her side facing away from him so he wouldn't see how happy he had made her with his words. Good night, Jack. Good night, Coral. Chapter 7. It wasn't long before Coral had the house exactly as she wanted it. All the windows had been scrubbed clean, and there were new curtains hanging from them. On Friday morning, she made lunch for Jack and sent him off to school, and then she did the breakfast dishes before walking over to see Esther. It was a longer walk than she'd realized, and it made her wish she'd ridden over, but she didn't mind too terribly much. It gave her time to think about her marriage and Jack's proposition to her. The night before he'd come home with flowers in his hand, a sweet gesture. She had fussed over the flowers and tucked them into a glass to put in the center of the table. She had found poems written out in his hand throughout the house. Not poems he had written, of course, but poems he had taken the time to copy from some of the great poets. She was starting to feel like he really might care for her. When she finally reached her sister's house, she knocked on the door, hoping Esther hadn't left for the day. Her sister opened the door wide and cried out as she grabbed her in a hug. You're just the person I needed to see today. Coral smiled. What can I help you with? It's not just that I need help with something, you know. I'm genuinely happy to see you. Esther waved her hand toward the table. Sit. Sit. Coral took a seat and smiled at her sister, who looked slightly frazzled. Is marriage easier with me gone? She asked softly. Esther sighed, sitting down across from her sister. I hope we didn't make you feel unwelcome. Coral shrugged. I understood why you didn't want me here. I don't know how my marriage would be if you were living with me. She smiled, letting Esther know she really did understand the problems she'd caused. How is marriage for you? Is he a good man? Coral nodded emphatically. A very good man. He actually seems to like my strangeness. Your strangeness? Don't speak in riddles, Coral. I always get confused when you do that. Coral wanted to laugh. She hadn't seen Esther in a week, and it was as if they'd only been apart 5 minutes. I'm sorry. He likes it that I'm good at so many things. Esther rolled her eyes. That you're good at everything, you mean? You scare me sometimes. I'm glad you've always been on my side, because I really wouldn't want you for an enemy. Coral bit her lip to keep from laughing at her sister's words. Jack's easy acceptance of what she considered her greatest weakness helped her see the humor in other people's fear of her. Why were you so glad to see me this morning? Esther sighed. I was trying to bake a cake. I've thrown out 4 already. I'm going to go through all the sugar and flour we have trying to make one dessert for my husband. I can help you with that. You should have just come over to get help. Esther nodded. I had decided to try once more, and if that didn't work, I was going to march right down to that house of yours and beg for your help. I came to invite you and Brody for supper tonight, Coral said as she walked to the work table. Esther seemed to consider for a moment, but then she shook her head. I do appreciate the offer, Coral, but not tonight. I want to cook a special meal for Brody tonight. Coral shrugged. All right. What kind of cake are you trying to make? Esther pointed to the recipe on the counter, and Coral walked over to look at it. Let's do it then. Coral spent the next hour showing her sister how to make a cake step by step. When they removed it from the oven, Esther's face lit up. It's beautiful. Will it taste good? Of course, it will. Best cake you've ever eaten. I promise. I believe you. Are you and Brody going to the dance at the schoolhouse tomorrow night? Coral asked. I didn't realize there was a dance. Oh, that sounds wonderful. So you'll go? Coral was almost desperate for her sister to be there, so she'd know at least one person other than Jack. Her husband would be called away from her to say the prayer over the meal and do other host-type things, and she wanted to have someone there she could talk to comfortably. Esther nodded. I don't know if Brody knows about it, but I promise you, we'll be there. I couldn't pass up the chance to go to a dance. I haven't done anything social at all since we left Massachusetts. I feel like I may have forgotten how to waltz already. Coral wanted to laugh at her sister's lament. I promise you haven't forgotten how to dance. Even I remember how, and I never put those lessons to good use. You should have allowed one of the young men back in Massachusetts to court you. No one ever asked. Because they were afraid of you. To keep a man, you have to show him that you're not better at everything than he is. Esther shook her head. I've been telling you the same thing for years. You have to pretend to be inept at least once in a while, so a man won't feel overwhelmed by you. No, I really don't have to do that, Coral insisted. Jack likes me just as I am. Jack, is it? Brody always refers to him as Jackson. He's asked me to call him Jack. Esther took her sister's hand. He's kind to you? He doesn't hurt you? Coral's face transformed into a grin. He's kinder to me than I ever dreamed imaginable. He's a good, caring man. I needed him in my life. I've been worried about you, and I wanted to go see you on Monday, but Brody told me not to interfere. I promise you, he's wonderful. He treats me like I'm someone very special. You are someone special. Esther stood up and walked to the work table. I need to make lunch for Brody. Any suggestions? Coral smiled, shaking her head at her sister. Do you want me to make lunch? That would be wonderful, if you don't mind. I don't. While Esther watched, Coral fixed lunch for the couple. Are you sure you're making enough? Esther asked. It's just the two of you. But you can't make lunch and then run off. I'll feel guilty. No need. I want to see if I can do a bit of hunting before dinner, Coral explained. It would be nice if I could make a good venison steak, and then I'd have meat to dry for the winter. But how would you get the deer home if you were able to shoot it? Esther asked, practically. I'd gut it right there in the woods and make it lighter, and then I'd drag it back. Trust me, I'm capable. There's nothing you can't do. Trust me. I remember. Coral shrugged. I'm not ashamed of it anymore. Why would you ever be ashamed of it? You were telling me to hide it from a man just a short while ago. You must think I should be ashamed. Esther stared at her sister, astonishment clear on her face. Oh no, Coral. That's never what I meant at all. I was never meaning to tell you that you shouldn't be so good at everything. Just that we all need to play these little games with men so they think they're better than us. See the difference? Not at all. It's fine, though. I'm not ashamed, and I won't be again. Jack has helped me to see that how I am is really a good thing. He calls me his marvel. I'm so glad he's giving you the confidence you should have always had. Esther grabbed her sister in a spontaneous hug. You deserve to be happy. Coral kept those words in mind as she walked home to get the rifle. She did deserve to be happy. She wasn't at fault for her mother becoming a recluse. Her birth mother and her father had been at fault for that. She hadn't caused her birth, and she couldn't control the circumstances of them. So therefore, she shouldn't be forced to spend the rest of her life repenting for other people's actions. Asterisk. Jack was outside with the children for their lunch break when he heard the rifle. He smiled, wondering what fabulous meal Coral would be making that evening. Had she found the latest poem he'd left for her? She hadn't commented on them, but the night before, she'd walked around the house with a dreamy look on her face, and when he'd pulled her to him to kiss her goodnight, she'd gone willingly into his arms. He still couldn't believe his luck. With as many bachelors as there were in the area, she'd chosen him. He didn't deserve to have her, but he was glad he did. All he had to do was wait a little longer for her to turn 18. Every day since he'd made that deal with her, he'd regretted it. She was worth waiting for, though. As he walked home, he looked around for fresh flowers to replace the ones gracing their table. She deserved to always have something new and pretty around her. Every day, she seemed to spend a little more time on her appearance, and she seemed to get prettier and prettier. He didn't know if his feelings were just growing so she seemed prettier to him, but he didn't think that was it at all. She truly was doing something that made her prettier. He hadn't been sure how he felt about her hair when he'd first seen her. He'd always liked a true deep red head, but her hair was more the orange of a carrot. Now, every day she pulled her hair back in a becoming style, and he realized that her hair was a part of her beauty. She may not be beautiful to other men, but to him, she was one of the loveliest women he'd ever seen. When he walked through the door, he saw her sitting at the table, carefully mending a tear in a pair of his pants. She was willing to work hard to make certain he didn't have to waste a dime of his hard-earned money. She never asked him to buy her anything, except supplies, so she could make his meals. He took the pants from her and set them on the table, and then he took her hand, pulling her to her feet. I've missed you today, he said, handing her the flowers he'd picked. She took the flowers and buried her face in them. They're lovely. Not half as lovely as you. He pulled her to him, kissing her softly. Did you have a good day? She nodded. Esther had supper plans already, so they're not coming tonight, but they'll be at the dance tomorrow. At least you'll get to see her there. She said something that made me wonder today. Jack pulled back, looking at her. I hope she didn't make you feel like you're doing something wrong. He barely knew Esther, but he felt like the majority of Coral's insecurities came from her sister. Coral shook her head. No, not at all. But she told me that the reason none of the men in Massachusetts wanted to court me is because I am too good at everything. And that I should have pretended to be bad at things, so men could feel superior. He laughed. A lot of men probably would have preferred if you did that. But not you? Not me. Why should you pretend to not be good at something? There's no point. I have a woman who can conquer the world with one hand tied behind her back. What's wrong with that? Coral buried her face in the front of his shirt. Not one little thing. Chapter 8. After supper, Jack looked at his wife with a look of pure admiration. This meal was amazing. Coral smiled. I'm glad you enjoyed it. She'd made venison steak and paired it with baked potatoes and fresh bread. What do you think I should make for the dance tomorrow? I could do just some bread or biscuits and a cake. Or would you prefer I made a full meal? He grinned. Truthfully, I'd rather never eat another person's cooking as long as I live. Why didn't you tell me you were such an amazing cook? She looked over her shoulder at him with a laugh. Jack, I did. You told me no one can be good at everything. Remember? I do remember. I really didn't think it was possible. He shook his head. I guess I've been proven wrong. She laughed. Well, at least I can safely say I wasn't overstating how well I do things. You truly are a marvel. He got up and walked over to a small table where he'd put his papers to grade when he'd come in that afternoon. I am still not entirely caught up on grading papers after taking the weekend off. I'm afraid I'll be working all evening again. Do you want my help again? I'm always willing. You do so much. I hate to ask you to spend your time helping me with my work. Coral shrugged. We're married, and I truly believe a woman should be a helper to her man. I'm more than willing to do it. He finally nodded. I'd like that. She smiled. Let me just finish the dishes, and I'll be ready. 15 minutes later, she brought over a big plate of cookies, 2 saucers, and 2 glasses of milk. I thought we might enjoy a snack while we work on the papers. Jack took a cookie and placed it on the saucer. Thank you. I appreciate you always thinking of me. Coral smiled. I'm your wife. It's my job to think of the little comforts. He shook his head at her. I hope you know that you don't have to. I do understand how busy you are during the day. She chuckled at that. Perhaps I will be once the children start coming along, but for now, I'm not busy at all. I've caught up on the housework. I'm working on sewing some curtains, but once I'm done with that, I'll have nothing to do but cook and keep things clean, which is easy now that the house is already there. You weren't raised for this kind of work. I'm always amazed at how you seem to have taken to it. I may not have been raised for hard work, but I was never meant to sit around doing nothing. My parents accepted that early on, and they learned not to ask how I kept myself busy. They hated the time I spent in the kitchen, learning to cook and bake, but I enjoyed it so much. The cook was really like a second mother to me. When I was young, before my father died, we had money. We lived in a fancy house, back in New York, and my mother sat around doing nothing but embroidering. She was miserable. My father was given to drink, and he wasn't a kind man. He took the math papers from the stack in front of him and put them in a pile in front of her. She remarried soon after he died to a good man. She had a hard time getting used to doing the household chores, though. They were foreign to her. She had to learn to cook, and she hated it. I see. So were you expecting me to be like your mother? He shrugged. I really didn't know what to expect, but I thought it was a possibility. Coral reached out and took his hand in hers. I genuinely enjoy sewing. I'm not fond of scrubbing floors, but I don't know of a single woman who is. I will do whatever is required of me as your wife, and I'll do it with a smile on my face. I've chosen to marry you and to live this life with you. It's up to me to choose to be happy in it. Are you certain you're only 17? Truly, he had never expected that much wisdom from a girl of her age. She nodded. That's what my parents tell me anyway. When exactly is your birthday? He tried to keep his voice casual with the question, but he was sure she'd understand why he was asking. November 1st. So it's not 2 months away. It's more like 4.5 weeks away. It's already the end of September. She nodded, blushing as she pulled the papers toward her. Yes. He changed the subject, seeing that the topic embarrassed her. He loved that she blushed, but he loved everything about her. A week before he'd have scoffed at the notion that he could fall in love with this young, headstrong woman, but there was something terribly special about her. He just hoped he could find a way to convince her to trust him with her heart. Asterisk. Coral took him at his word the next day, fixing venison stew to take to the dance, as well as bread, and 24 cookies for dessert. She knew it was too much to take, but she didn't care. If Jack only wanted to eat her cooking, then he had that right. He spent the day at the table, finishing up the paper grading that needed to be done, while she first cooked, and then joined him at the table. "Do you want help grading papers?" He shook his head. "No, I'm working on essays now. There's really no way someone else could grade them." She pulled out one of her anatomy books instead. "I'll just study then." She flipped to the page she had last been working on back in Massachusetts, and pored over the book. Jack watched her for a few minutes, noting how quickly she flipped the pages. It was as if she was looking at the pictures and turning to the next page without actually reading the words. There was no way she could possibly be retaining anything. Coral looked up, realizing he was watching her. "What? You're not actually reading the words?" She sighed. "Yes, I am." "How can you be? You're spending mere seconds on each page." He'd never seen anyone read with anything approaching the speed she was reading. She frowned. "I thought you were used to me." "What does that even mean?" She turned the book back 2 pages before pushing it across the table to him. "Start reading in the top left-hand corner of the page," she instructed him. He gave her a perplexed look before looking down at the page. Coral closed her eyes and recited the first paragraph to him, without missing a single word. "How?" It was one simple word, but there was a great deal of emotion in it. She shrugged, taking the book back from him. "I don't know. I wish I did. I've been able to do that since I was a little girl." She looked down at her hands, wishing she had an explanation. "I showed my mother when I first started school. I thought it was a good thing." She shook her head. The look of horror on her face will stay with me forever. "I've never shown anyone else, and I don't think Mama ever really believed what she saw." "That's incredible." I've never seen anything like it. I can do it with other things too. It's like I can see something done once, and I will remember how to do it forever. I don't tell people, because I don't want them to think there's something wrong with me." "There's nothing wrong with you." Jack took her hand in his. "Truly, you are an amazing woman. I knew it a week ago, but now, watching that, I don't even know what to say. I love being able to learn so much so quickly, but I hate not being able to show that I have knowledge. I have to hide, so people don't lock me away somewhere." "Lock you away?" She shrugged. "I've always had in my head that if people found out how easily and quickly I learned things, they would lock me in an asylum." Jack shook his head at her. "No, but they might lock you in a laboratory and study you." "I don't want that either. I want to live a normal life." "Well, I want to be a doctor, but I'd settle for being a midwife." "I'd be a good one." "You would. There's no doubt in my mind." "Is that why you continue to study the medical books?" She shrugged. "I need something to do. I go crazy just sitting around. I thought about adding on a room to the house, but I wasn't sure what you'd think of that, so I will just study the medical textbooks I brought with me." He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "Do you think you could add a room onto the house?" She nodded. "I have no doubt. I read how to build a house in a book once. I'm sure adding a room on wouldn't be much different. I have science books, and literature books, and poetry books. They're all in a trunk in the bedroom. Please feel free to read through it if you run out of other things to read." "You don't mind?" She was still half afraid he'd reject her, knowing her deepest, darkest secret. He shook his head. "I think it's wonderful that you want to keep learning. I want to see you excel at everything, and you already do." She smiled at that. "Not at everything." "I thought you said you were good at everything," he said with a wink. "I'm not good at people," she admitted, her voice soft. "I don't know how to relate. I even frighten my own sister sometimes." "Oh, she doesn't tell me that, but I can tell." It's all over her face. Esther has never seen you do what you just did for me? You're sure? Coral nodded. I'm positive. I've been so careful to hide it. But she's still seen me shoot a gun into the center of a target the first time I picked one up. She's seen me do so many things that seem impossible. But they are possible. You do them. She nodded. I just wish I knew why and how. The why is because you're brilliant. The how? I guess because you were born that way. As far as I'm concerned, there need be no further explanation. He sighed. You probably shouldn't let anyone else see it though. I'm afraid you're right about how afraid people would be. Because they're afraid I'll try to take over the world? Not at all. Because they're afraid you would succeed without trying. He brought her hand to his lips. I need to work on these essays now. Please, continue glancing at the pages so you can memorize them. I don't think anyone would object to having a skilled healer in the community. Even one who didn't have the formal training to go with it. Thank you. Why are you thanking me? Because you're accepting me for who I am. That means so much. He smiled. I always will. Never be afraid to share your secrets with me. Chapter 9. At the dance, Coral felt extremely shy. She'd never enjoyed being around huge crowds of people like her sister did. She stayed close to Jack's side and met the parents of his students. Mrs. Sanford, this is my wife, Coral. Coral smiled, holding her hand out to the older woman. It's so nice to meet you, Mrs. Sanford. We had no idea our dear teacher was even courting anyone, but we're happy to welcome you to our community, Mrs. Smythe. I'm happy to be here. Coral hoped the woman would move on, because she had absolutely nothing to say to her. Where are you from? Mrs. Sanford asked. I lived in Massachusetts until just recently. Please walk away. Please walk away. Wow. That's far away. Are you any relation to Mrs. Finnegan? Coral should have known Esther would already have met at least half the community. She was so outgoing. What Coral wouldn't give for just a bit of that now. Yes, she's my sister. Mrs. Sanford's brows drew together, and Coral could read her mind. They don't look like sisters. I see. Mrs. Sanford took her leave then, and Coral sighed heavily. What's wrong? Jack asked, his hand going to the small of her back. I'm being compared to Esther again and found lacking. That's because they've never seen you do mathematics in your head. Or seen you barely glance at a page before memorizing it. If they could see those things, they'd be impressed. And shocked and frightened, Coral couldn't believe it when a giggle escaped her. She was making fun of how different she was, and she didn't think she'd ever been able to do that before. Jack laughed, the sound loud and booming, causing everyone to turn and look their way. Several of the men gave approving nods. Esther entered the schoolhouse then, and sashayed across the room. Coral couldn't believe just how much her sister filled up a room. She stopped to talk to everyone as she walked through the small building. All of the desks had been taken outside for the evening, and would be returned after the party. Coral leaned over and whispered to Jack, I wish I could be half as likable as she is. She has everyone in the room eating out of the palm of her hand, and she just arrived. You're not jealous of your sister, are you? Only a lot. She put on a brave face as Esther made her way over to her. I'm glad you were able to make it. Esther smiled, reaching out to hug her sister. Of course, I made it. I wouldn't miss this for anything. She was wearing her prettiest dress, a pink silk gown with an embroidered bodice. The only woman in the room wearing gloves, she should have looked odd, but instead, she made every other woman in the room look positively dowdy. Where's Brody? Jack asked, not able to stop himself from comparing the sisters. The first time he'd seen them together, his wife had been the loser in the comparison. This time, though, he could see the inner beauty his wife displayed. Her sister was kind enough, but she didn't glow from within the way Coral did. He seeing to the horses. "You brought the wagon?" Coral asked, without thinking first. Of course they brought the wagon. Her sister wouldn't dream of walking all that way, dancing the night away, and then walking home again. "I didn't want to mess up my gown by walking," Esther said, as if her sister should have known that's what she was thinking. "Of course not." Jack smiled at Esther. "It's good to see you again." Esther nodded at her new brother-in-law. "And you. I hope you're taking good care of my baby sister." "It's my job. And she's taking good care of me as well." "I'm sure she is." "Brody is missing her cooking already." "You're welcome to come to our place for supper any time." He made the offer automatically, hoping she wouldn't take him up on it. He knew Esther was a lot of the reason Coral thought so little of herself. "Thank you." Esther turned toward the door, her eyes catching Brody. "There's my man." Brody was in the doorway, and his eyes were scanning the room. When they lit on Esther, he walked toward her as if pulled her way by a magnet. When he'd reached his wife, his arm went about her shoulders, anchoring her to his side. Brody's eyes met Jackson's. "How's married life, Mr. Smythe?" Jack smiled. "I couldn't have asked for a more beautiful, sweet woman. I'm thrilled with married life." Brody looked surprised. "You are?" He looked back and forth between Coral and Jackson. "Of course you are. Coral's an excellent cook." "She is. She's wonderful at so many things, isn't she? I just thank God every day that she chose me." Brody seemed to want to argue with Jack's version of events, but he didn't. "You are a fortunate man." Jack nodded. "That I am." He kissed Coral's cheek. "I need to say the blessing, and then we'll eat." He looked at Esther. "Did you put your dish on the table?" "Oh, I knew Coral would make enough for both of us." Jack blinked for a moment, having a hard time believing that she'd said that. She was right though. Yes, she made enough for several households. "Excuse me, I'll say the prayer." Coral watched him as he said the prayer and then led the way to the food table. He not only filled a plate for himself, but he filled one for her as well. Coral was thankful. They stood around eating while holding their plates in their hands. "I got a big portion of your stew," Jack told Coral. "It's delicious as always." After they'd eaten, it was time for the dance, and Coral realized that other than her debutante ball, she hadn't danced with a man. When Jack took her into his arms and slowly began to twirl her around the room, she felt like she was dancing on air. He was a good dancer, guiding her through the steps seamlessly. "Where did you learn to dance so well?" she asked. "My mother. She hated that I wasn't getting the kind of upbringing I'd been born for, so she would dance with me in the evenings, so I could return to the life I'd had to leave when she married my stepfather." "I don't understand. How could you return to it?" "My grandparents would have taken us in, and did for a short time, before she decided to remarry. I always had an open invitation to go back east and take up the reins of my grandfather's business." "What did he do?" she asked. "He owned a bank." "And you didn't want to do that?" He shook his head emphatically. "My grandfather disapproved of my stepfather, and I felt like he treated him unfairly. Although his mistreatment didn't extend to me, I had no desire to be part of the lifestyle that led people to look down on others. We're all equal." She smiled and nodded. "I agree. Wholeheartedly." After the dance was over, he and some of the other men put the desks back into the schoolhouse, and Coral was pleased to see that Brody was one of the men who helped. Esther stood beside her, yawning. "You seem very tired tonight," Coral said. Esther shrugged. "I'm not used to all the physical labor. I'll get to where I'm good at it though. Brody is worth that to me." When the men had finished, the sisters said goodnight with hugs, and Coral set off with Jack toward their home. "That went better than I expected," she told him. "You didn't expect it to go well?" She shrugged. "I really don't do well with people. I know you don't believe me, but I tend to be prickly because I get so overwhelmed." "Like you were the night we met?" he asked, finally understanding why she'd seemed to be a different person the night he'd met her. "Exactly. I don't know why you agreed to marry me. I was very nervous, and you agreed to cook all my meals." She laughed. "I always knew you had only one thing on your mind when you married me." He shrugged. "I don't deny it. And I have to say, you fulfilled that duty admirably. Now I have something entirely different on my mind, but that will still have to wait." She turned her head to him, a slight grin on her face. "We'll know each other so much better in a month. Don't you think this period of getting to know who we are without the marriage bed interfering is good for us?" "You know, I really do. Most of the time. But sometimes, I just want to have my way with you." She laughed. "You make it sound positively naughty, Mr. Smythe." He wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her closer to him. "Not when it's between married people." She sighed contentedly. "Thank you for being so attentive this evening. I think Esther was worried about me until she saw us together." "And she's not worried any longer?" "She doesn't seem to be. She seems to be surprised that we genuinely like each other, but she no longer is worried." "That's a good thing, I guess." "Oh, it surely is." She thought of something she'd been wanting to mention. "Is it possible for us to get a dog or a cat? I spend so many hours alone that I feel like an animal would be the perfect companion." He thought about it for a moment. "Why don't I ask around and see if anyone has a new litter they're trying to get rid of? I wouldn't mind having an animal around either." He opened the door to the house and let her precede him inside. "Do you have a preference of a dog or a cat?" She shrugged. "I'd prefer a dog, but a cat would be helpful with rodents." She'd seen mice in the house a few times and would be glad to get rid of them. "So you'd be happy with either?" She nodded. "I want a dog, but I can see the benefits of a cat. I'll see what I can do to make that happen." He yawned widely. "It's been a long day. Are you ready for bed?" She nodded. "Just give me 5 minutes." "Are you certain that's long enough?" He'd gotten into the habit of giving her exactly 20 minutes every night. "I might still be braiding my hair when you come in, but if that won't bother you, 5 minutes is enough." "I'll see you in 5 minutes then." He leaned down to kiss her cheek before heading outside. As he wandered, he thought about how uncomfortable she'd truly been that night, and he realized something about her. She was much more at home with books than she ever would be with people. It wasn't a criticism, of course, because he understood the feeling completely. For the most part, he felt exactly the same way. He'd rather be with books than anyone else in the world. Except for her, of course. In just one short week, his Coral had managed to worm her way into his heart. He loved her. He knew then he wanted to find a special way to tell her. Something that would make her realize that he accepted everything about her, and not just the parts that he liked. It would have to be a grand gesture of some sort, and it would take some planning. He'd do it though, because she mattered so much to him. Chapter 10. The next month flew by, with Coral getting to know Jack a bit better every day. On the eve of her birthday, she sat with him in front of the warm stove. He was grading papers while she read one of her anatomy books. "This is my last book," she said. She wanted to ask for more, but she knew they really didn't have the money. He sighed. "And there's no point in your trying to reread anything because you have it all memorized still." He reached out and took her hand. "I do wish I could buy you a whole library of books." "I know. I'm just going to need a new project to keep me busy for a while." She looked out the window, watching the snow fall. This is going to be a very long winter if I'm home all the time with nothing to do. I know you were collecting some scraps of cloth. Do you have enough to make a quilt? I do, and I'll start on one tomorrow. It wouldn't take her nearly long enough, but she could stay occupied for a while with it. Will you have time to bake a cake tomorrow? He asked. She shrugged. Sure, I can do that. Nothing else to do. He patted her hand and went back to grading the papers in front of him. He wanted to finish them, so he'd have the weekend free. He wanted to tell her about his birthday surprise for her, but he wasn't going to spoil it. He'd worked too hard to get everything just right without her knowing. Asterisk. When Coral woke the following morning, she stretched and rolled over. She loved to see Jack's head on the pillow beside hers every morning. She sat straight up in bed when she realized he wasn't lying beside her. Where could he be? In all their weeks of being married, he'd never woken up before she did. She rolled from the bed, shivering, and grabbed her wrapper, pulling it over her shoulders. Opening the bedroom door, she peeked out and saw Jack on one knee in front of the stove, starting a fire. What are you doing up so early? She asked. He sighed. He'd slept too late for the first part of her surprise. Without answering, he finished lighting the fire and then stood up. I wanted to make breakfast for you for a change. For your birthday. She frowned. It's not my birthday. Not for another week. He grinned. Did you lose track of the days? It's November 1st. Happy birthday, Coral. He walked to her and pulled her into his arms, kissing her sweetly. She wrapped her arms around his neck, smiling up at him. Well, I'm glad you remembered, because I seem to have forgotten. Well, you sit down, and I'll make you some breakfast. She watched him for a moment as he got down a pan and cut off some pieces of bacon, putting them into the cold iron skillet without even heating it first. You know what, Jack? I know how much you hate to cook. I'll do it. He looked at her over his shoulder. I wanted to make your birthday morning special for you. You already have, just by remembering. She took the skillet from him and removed the bacon, then put the pan on the stove to heat it. I was supposed to heat the pan first? He asked, watching her carefully. He wanted to be able to at least make breakfast sometimes. She nodded. The bacon will be crispier that way. She broke the eggs into a bowl and added a dollop of milk before using a fork to mix them, holding the bowl against her belly. You look beautiful this morning, Coral. She looked at him with wide eyes. You don't have to tell me that. I know I'm not a beauty. I disagree. The more I know you, the more beautiful I realize you are. It's like there's something inside you that just radiates goodness and beauty. Have you been reading more love poems? He shook his head. I haven't. Those were my own words. He watched as she removed the bacon from the pan and poured out some of the grease before adding the egg mixture. Have you enjoyed the poems? Coral blushed and nodded. I've kept every one of them. Have you now? Why didn't you say anything about them? He'd left her at least one poem a day in various places around the house for her to find. I didn't know what to say. No one has ever tried to woo me before. Is it working? Is what working? My efforts to woo you. Are they working? She nodded slowly as she stirred the eggs, not looking at him. You're awfully good at it. He smiled at that, pleased she'd been happy with his efforts. I'm glad you think so. I'm not so certain myself. Why not? He shrugged. Well, I still don't know where I stand with my own wife. You'd think if I was good at wooing, I'd at least know how she felt about me. I don't know what to say to that. She knew she loved him, but she wasn't sure she was ready to give him that kind of power over her. What if he didn't love her back? Then she'd be crushed. He walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his cheek atop her head. You don't have to say anything just yet. But I have to say something later? He shrugged. I can't ever force you to say anything. I hope you'll want to say something. She carefully removed the skillet from the top of the stove and rested it on a potholder before turning in his arms. She was very aware that now she was 18, all their agreements were over, and he could start asking for more from her any time he wanted. I think you're an amazing husband. He smiled, stroking her cheek. That'll do to begin with. She stood on tiptoe and kissed him softly before turning back to the food she'd prepared. Sit down, and I'll serve this. He shook his head. No, you sit down and I'll serve, and I'm cleaning up afterward. Maybe I can't cook, but I know how to put food on a plate and wash a few dishes. Are you sure? She felt like she was doing something wrong by letting him serve her. It was supposed to be the other way around. He nodded. I'm positive. Sit. He scooped the eggs onto 2 plates and added bacon while she made her way to the table. Then he took the toast she'd prepared from the oven and slathered it with butter, adding 2 pieces to each plate. Carrying them to the table, he asked, Do you want coffee? Yes, please. She waited as he got coffee and forks for both of them and sat across from her. Taking her hand, he blessed their meal. I'm sorry I didn't have time to make breakfast before you got up like I'd planned. I really appreciate the thought, and it'll be nice not to have to do the dishes for a change. While Jack did the dishes, Coral went into the bedroom to dress for the day. She wondered what else her new husband had in store for her, because it was apparent he'd thought about this day a great deal. When she stepped into the main room, she saw that he was just putting the last of the dishes on the shelf. Thank you for doing the dishes for me, Jack. It's a perfect birthday present. Jack turned to her and smiled. Do you want to bake the cake now? And I can give you your presents at lunchtime? Presents? When did you have time to get me a present? She was surprised he'd even thought of anything. She walked to him and wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling his head down for a kiss. You're the best husband in the whole world. You know that? You don't even know what I got you yet. What if I got you some new linens so you can make me underwear? Or some yarn so you can make me socks? Then I'll thank you kindly for giving me something to do to get me through the longer winter months. He shook his head. Well, I should have thought of those things then. She smiled, enjoying his playfulness. So often he was serious, and she loved it when he showed this side of himself. Whatever it is, I will be thankful that you even remembered my birthday. How could I forget? He looked into her eyes, making it clear that he remembered very well what his promise to her had been. This is a date that I have had in my mind for a good while now. She blushed. Well, it's finally here. Bake the cake. I have just a few more papers to grade while you do, and then I can take the rest of the weekend off to be with you. She smiled at that. All right. I'll get to it right now. Stay out of the bedroom for the rest of the day, will you? What? She turned to him. What are you doing back there? He shrugged, a huge grin on his face. Just stay out until I say you can go in. Whatever you say. Coral turned away, unable to stifle the smile that spread across her face. He had an air of secrecy about him that was a lot of fun for her. She started by baking some bread, so they'd have enough to make it through the weekend, and then used some of the venison she'd shot the day before to make another stew. Venison stew was his favorite meal, so she did her best to make it as much as she could. She'd started curing the hides of the animals as well, knowing they would be able to sell them eventually. She baked gingerbread, knowing it was his favorite, and topped it with whipped cream. He stayed back in the bedroom, and a couple of times she heard him grunting, as if he was doing something hard. She heard hammering as well and wondered what on earth the man was doing in there. Finally, it was time for lunch, and she called to him. Jack? It's time for lunch. Are you finished? I'll be right out. Jack slipped through a very narrow opening in the door, not trusting her not to look. I'm finished, but you still don't get to go in there until after we've had our cake, and I've washed the lunch dishes. She sighed. I'm going to die of curiosity. He shrugged. Patience is a virtue. Don't you want to be virtuous? Not particularly. Usually, she did, but right that second, she just wanted to see what he'd been working on. He caught her arm and turned her toward the table. Eat first. Fine. She sat down at the table she'd already set and waited for him to take his spot. After their prayer, she started asking him questions. Can you give me just one hint? You'll like it. That's not a hint. I want a real hint. Coral, you'll never get to see it if you don't hurry and eat. Truthfully, he was impatient as well. He'd been working on her birthday surprise for over a month, and he couldn't wait for her to see what he'd done. Coral ate quickly, wanting to know right away. She'd never been so impatient to see what a surprise was in her entire life. When she was finished, she sat back and patted her stomach. I don't think I'm hungry enough for cake. He frowned. I guess we'll wait until you get hungry enough for cake for your surprise then. She glared at him. Fine. I'll get us both some cake. I'll get the cake. You sit here. Instead of obeying Jack, she jumped up and put the dishes in the basin. She'd already started the hot water boiling, so the dishes could be done immediately. Jack got them each a piece of the gingerbread and a glass of milk. I said to stay seated. I'm just trying to help it go quicker. He shook his head. You're worse than a small child. She shrugged. I'm sorry. The truth was, no one had ever bothered to get to know her well enough to give her a gift that she cared about before. She knew Jack would be the first, and she couldn't wait to see what he'd done. After her cake, she jumped up and put the dishes in the basin. May I help you wash them? She asked. He sighed. You can wipe. I'll wash. She knew she could wash them faster, but she didn't protest. At least they'd finish faster by working together. Leave the pot of stew for our supper. He nodded, knowing better than to throw away that much food. Finally, they finished. He turned to her. Put your coat and mittens on. She looked toward the bedroom door with a frown. But coat and mittens. She decided not to argue, pulling her coat on quickly and buttoning it. She watched as he put his coat on as well. She had no idea where they were going, but she could tell he was going to be stubborn and insist they do whatever it was before they went into the bedroom for her surprise. She pulled her mittens on and looked at him. I'm ready. He took her mittened hand in his. Come on. He led her out to the small barn that was on the property. It was barely big enough to call a barn, but it housed 1 cow and 2 horses. He opened the big door leading into the building and waited for her to precede him. As soon as the door opened, Coral could hear yelps. She squealed and hurried around Jack, rushing into the barn and stopping short as she saw a puppy pulling at a rope that was tied around his neck. Oh, Jack. He's beautiful. She dropped to her knees and hugged the jumping, yelping dog to her. He was only about knee-high, but his feet were huge. He was going to be a big dog. Will that help you stay happy while I'm working? She jumped up and threw her arms around him, hugging him close. I couldn't have asked for a better birthday gift. Thank you so much. Jack smiled, stroking her back. I'm glad you like him. Do you want to take him inside with us when you see your other gift? I can't believe there's more. He reached down and untied the puppy, leading him into the house. The animal was thrilled to be there, sniffing around everywhere exploring. After they'd both taken off their coats, he took her hand and led her to the bedroom door. I'm not quite finished, but it's close enough for you to know what I'm doing. And really, I think you'll want to do the next part yourself. She looked at him curiously, but didn't ask. Instead, she waited as he opened the door, and she peered inside. Oh, Jack. Tears filled her eyes. No one had seen her cry since she'd been a small child, but she couldn't control herself. She stepped into the room and walked to the small bookcase he'd built for her, stroking it with her hand. I can't wait to put my books on it. He shook his head. That's not your present. She looked at him, the tears streaming freely down her face now. It's not? No, that's where you will keep your present. He indicated a large crate in the corner of the room. She walked over to the crate and lifted the lid off. Her breath caught, and she sucked in a breath. Jack. How? She asked nothing else as she flew to him again, burying her face against the front of his shirt. He held her to him, happy she'd reacted as he'd expected. I love you with everything inside me, Coral Smythe. She smiled up at him, pulling his head down for a kiss. And I love you even more, Jackson Smythe. And I'm not just saying that because you got me a crate of medical books for my birthday. He grinned. It's not all medical books. It's not? He shook his head. No. It's mostly medical books, but there's one book on how to add a room to your home. I thought we could do that together this summer. She smiled. And what will we do with that room? I think a new room is needed for a midwife's office, don't you? And we'll make sure there are bookshelves all around for your ever-increasing library. Wait, you wouldn't mind if I opened a midwife practice? He shook his head. It sounds like you've spent enough time learning under an experienced midwife. You know medical books better than most doctors. I made certain to get you books that would concentrate on pregnancy. Some are general knowledge, of course, but at least half are about the birthing process. Do you realize the gift you're giving me? She asked softly. Not just by giving me the books, but by telling me you don't mind if I work. He nodded. I know what you want and need, because I know you. You are truly a marvel, Coral, and I'm not going to let you hide your accomplishments from the world. I don't want to share you, but you're too special. I don't have a choice. The tears were flowing again, more freely than before, as she buried her face against his shirt. I don't know what I've ever done to deserve you, Jack. He held her to him. It's I who am blessed to have you. Epilogue. Coral sat on the edge of her sister's bed, wiping Esther's brow. Trust you to do everything wrong, Esther. Do you just try to be difficult? Esther glared at her sister as she lay back, resting between pushes. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm having a baby. Yes, but you're having an upside-down baby. It's coming out feet first. Esther closed her eyes and laid back. So now what? Coral shrugged. I'm going to have to reach up and help him come out. She frowned. I need you to wait until I tell you to push, and then I'll help guide him out. It's the only way. Just do it. Coral didn't blame her sister for being grumpy. She'd been laboring for more than 24 hours, and they were both worn out. 20 minutes later, Coral handed the now clean baby boy to his mother. He's perfect, Esther. You did it. Esther reached out and took Coral's hand in hers. No. We did it. I'm so glad you were with me. Now you need to have a little boy, so my son can have a cousin. Coral patted her round belly. She had 2 more months to go until her precious baby came into the world. I don't know. I want a girl first. What does Jackson say? Coral grinned at that. Jack? He says he wants a dozen little girls who will be just like their mother. Esther smiled wearily. I'm glad we came out here and found good men. Coral smiled, Knowing if their father had never been discovered to be embezzling money, and Esther's fiancé hadn't thrown her over, she would never have been able to be a midwife, and she certainly wouldn't have found happiness with a wonderful man like Jack. I wouldn't change any of the events of the past 13 months for the whole world. She stood. I'm going to go get Brody. I think it's time he met his son.